Good evening. My name is Carol Allman Morton, and I'm the Executive Director here at OLLI at Berkshire Community College, and I'm so glad to welcome you this evening. I want to thank our OLLI at BCC sponsor, Berkshire Health Systems, berkshirehealthsystems.org, and our OLLI at BCC Distinguished Speaker Series sponsor, Kimball Farms Life Care, kimballfarms.org. You can go to berkshireolli.com/events to see our full calendar of programming. A few highlights of upcoming OLLI programs. Our winter session of courses begins next week, and registration is still open at berkshireolli.org/winter 2026. And OLLI also just posted a new lecture, Tyrants, Smugglers, and Hostile Takeovers, U.S.-Venezuela Relations with Professor Javier Corrales from Amherst College, and that will be on Wednesday, February 18th at 7 p.m. on Zoom. And you can see the full calendar of OLLI at BCC programming at berkshireolli.org/events. More winter and spring lectures and workshops are being added regularly. As we go tonight, please put questions in the chat. You don't have to worry about forgetting them. Put them in anytime, and we will get to as many as we can. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome back Tom Gerety. Tom has taught constitutional law through most of his career. He retired as Collegiate Professor of Law and Humanities at NYU. He headed up the Brennan Center for Justice and was president of both Trinity and Amherst Colleges. He has law and philosophy degrees from Yale. And so, Tom, I'm going to be here. You'll see my face, but I'm going to go away from the spotlight and turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Carol, and thank you to the Ray and the staff and Judith and everybody for the volunteers who work on this. Hello, everyone. When I decided or talked to people like Carol and others about possibly doing something quickly, I thought that it would be a relatively narrow thing to talk about. And as I worked on this in the last few days, and as you all, and I mean, I think many of us have been, in a sense, working on this, looking at videos and so on. It seemed to me just, in some sense, an enormous topic. And I think that reflects something that I really can't escape at this point in the second Trump presidency, second Trump administration from Donald J. Trump. And that is that I really do think we are facing fascism. And that most of the definitions of fascism by people like Robert Paxton are loose and include a variety of factors. But the celebration of violence and cruelty, the intervention into corporate life in a kind of Peronist or domineering way from the presidency, the picking on vulnerable populations with utter harshness and violence at times, and now grabbing citizens who stand up, whether it's going after, first it was what we might say the softer citizenry in the law firms and so on, and we see the television networks getting intimidated like CBS or bought out. But it seems to me we are really in a period of very close to fascism in the presidency in America. And there's a scorn for our constitutional traditions, for our norms, and really a celebration of the domineering monarchical or tyrannical quality. So it's a really sad time. And several of the people who volunteer and staff OLLI were saying, well, before we came on, we're saying, well, can you offer us some hopefulness? And I am very hopeful. I'm hopeful that we'll get through it. I'm hopeful that this will come to a crisis, which I think may be very soon, and end in a couple of years. But it's clearly, it seems undeniable that it's the worst period since the Civil War. And in terms of presidencies, it's by far, if we talk about the Antichrist, it's the anti-presidency that we have really almost never had anything like this before. So I begin with that very broad sense, and I hope I'm not telling you what to think. As a teacher, I try to always invite opposition, you might say. But I really am very sad and disheartened about the country. I've mentioned in several of these classes that my dad was what I would call a civil rights Republican who really worshiped or thought very highly of law and the Constitution, and who really stood up with us as kids and in his life for the idea that we should all be equal and have equal civil rights and not corrupt our government with lucre and buying people and all the things we're seeing with gold and cryptocurrency and everything else. So to me, it's a very, very sad time. I said before, and I'll say it again now, that great line that's repeated sometimes on the internet, the party of my dad and the party of Lincoln has become the party of Lincoln's assassins, in my view. The Republican Party really is going to have a lot to answer for in this period of American history. I'm going to start with an overview of several possibly remarkable events in the last month and a half that are hopeful, however, before I narrow down to the surges of this new Trumpian army, really, of Border Patrol and Immigration and Customs Enforcement people. And the maybe the most remarkable thing on the interim docket in the last couple of weeks is that Federal District Judge April Perry's early decision to say that the Chicago intervention by the National Guard was wrong and should be withdrawn was brought up to the Supreme Court on the emergency docket, and the Supreme Court majority of 6-3, with Alito and Thomas and Gorsuch joining those two, uh, upholding her decision pro tem. It's only pro tem, it's only for the time being, but it's extraordinary, and it means that let me quote the court, at this preliminary stage, the government, meaning the administration, has failed to identify a source of authority that would allow the military to execute the laws in Illinois. And that was the end of the National Guard call up that Trump had in Chicago. It was followed very quickly by Judge Good, who's, as I always like to say, an Amherst graduate, although before I got there, out in Portland, and her orders were made, at least again, pro tem, but for the time being, there's not going to be anything going on, no National Guard in Portland. And then Justice Breyer's younger brother, Charles Breyer, reinstated his order ordering the sort of disoccupation of Los Angeles. Several people have said, and it's an important point, and Trump made the point this morning, that this rejection of his call up of the National Guards against governors' wills in these various states, and you all know, I think, that Louisiana and Tennessee, I think, have the governors have accepted National guards in their Democratic cities. But this set of withdrawals seems to me very, very hopeful. It does, however, pull the trigger on the threat that Trump made this morning to resort to the Insurrection Act, which hasn't been called upon or invoked by a president since the elder Bush did in 1992, with support of the governor in California and Los Angeles for the Rodney King riots. So that we now face the possibility that President Trump will say, okay, well, I was rejected there, but I'll use the Insurrection Act, which does get him around some of the restraints. The restraint in that Judge Perry noticed, and that a professor named Liedermeyer at Georgetown has written a very good essay about just in the last couple of weeks, is that the actual language that allows the president to call up the National Guard without the consent of the governors says that the source of authority has to be one that would allow the military to execute the laws. And the question is the military, and it said the regular forces. And Trump sort of took the position that if the cops aren't doing it as regular forces, I can do it with the National Guard. And the Supreme Court upheld Judge Perry, saying, no, we're not talking about the cops having difficulty. I mean, we send, the cops can't do it. We're talking about if you can't do it with the Army. And that does sort of invite Trump to say, okay, now I'll try with the Army, as he did on the border. So that remains to be seen. And of course, that remains to be a big question, what the Supreme Court would do. Scholars like Fidel at Yale, who's somebody that was teaching when I was a young law student, have said it'd be outrageous to call in our military to these cities under the Insurrection Act, and clearly would, in his view, violate the intent of those original acts, original insurrection acts from the 1790s and early 1800s. I think he's probably the preeminent military law scholar that I know. and I will stand with him, but I think we're going to get a contrary interpretation from others. Nonetheless, that's a very hopeful thing. The second thing is that we're waiting now, and people were in the newspapers and the commentariat where it's talking just a couple of days ago that we're waiting for the tariffs decision. It's anticipated, especially with what's happening with the Fed Chief Powell, that there'll be a tariffs decision that rejects this massive and very arbitrary bunch of on and off tariffs that President Trump has been playing with for some months now. And we're most of people who study these things are very optimistic from the oral argument that that will be a rejection of what Trump has done so far with his kind of random throwing out of tariffs this way and that, like a mad king. And we're also waiting, and this may or may not take longer, we don't know, for the birthright citizenship decision, which almost everyone who studies constitutional law on whatever side of the fence feels is going to go, if you will, our way. That is to say, it's going to uphold the text that says all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the citizen in which they dwell. And those are good things and hopeful signs of spring, if you will, in what's going on. Let me now turn to what are called the surges, using the language in the administration of the recent foreign wars in which we were so tragically and somewhat hopelessly involved. I think you remember, I think the first surges, if you will, the first raids of size were on agricultural factory settings like meatpacking plants out in the Great Western Plains, and many of us noticed that. People saw that it was cruel. There were usually tens and hundreds of employees and fairly sizable roundups, but nothing like what's happened. We then had that the Korean engineers, who were two or three hundred of them, and workers who were rounded up in just an absurd uh, illustration of the vacillations and back and forths of the Trump administration on the question of chips and advanced technology, because these men and women were working to give us, in a hurry, a very top-notch chip making factory with huge subsidies from the government, which began in the Biden administration, of course. And then we had the surges in the cities, the midway surge for Chicago that's been going on and that ended just last week. And now the metro surge, as they're calling it, for Minnesota, St. Paul, and the surrounding suburban towns where there's been a lot of settlement by refugees, Somali as well as Latino. Trump, as you saw, called that in one of his tweets, the reckoning and retribution is here. Favorite kind of almost biblical language from him about his role in the world. Well, the thing to say about these surges as opposed to the National Guard is we're talking not about soldiers, but what I would call cops. They're law enforcement agents. They're immigration cops in the Border Patrol and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and they're behaving, of course, and I think that their behavior is part of what happened to Renée Good. They're behaving, I think, as most of us see it, almost like stormtroopers. Here's the enemy. We're in this town. It's a blue town. We don't like that. We can be rough and abusive. We can take shortcuts on due process. We can bash in doors when our administrative warrants are clearly do not allow us to do that. We're not allowed to go into homes that way. To me, they're marauding, and they're coming on with a sort of display of how powerful and well-armed and masked they are. One of the people, a friend of ours named Nancy Cohn, who's on this thing, said, "Don't forget to mention the masks." And so I will say something about the masks. We're not used to having, except for health reasons, we're not used to having cops mask their identities and so on. And the excuse that's been thrown out and upheld by the administration again and again is that these cops are, I don't know, especially disliked and thus, or resented, and thus being doxxed, meaning their addresses and identities are being bandied about on the internet, and thus their families are vulnerable. possibly true. But the other truth is that the masks give this stormtrooper sense, an almost Gestapo-like sense. These strangers covered in guns and vests, that bulletproof vests, as if we are the enemy, and as if immigrants, including those without documents, are themselves sort of these invaders, as President Trump has said. Do we have any law on masks? And the answer, I'm afraid, is, to my knowledge, no. There's litigation in California, but I think it's ongoing. But the governor has already surrendered on there's a law in California that these agents of the police are not the police, and agents of law enforcement are not allowed to wear masks and must identify themselves. But really absurdly, California legislature exempted the California Highway Patrols or some of the other enforcement arms of the California government. And I think that's a death knell for any possibility of winning on that. There's been other talk in New York and elsewhere that they're going to ban masks, but the feds are going to be able to override that. And I suspect they'll find sympathetic judges who say, well, in the course of this work, the Supremacy Clause puts the feds in a special position and the masks are justified. But it's well worth saying that it's another, along with the uniforms and all the heavy armament in a civilian situation, it's part, it seems to me, of this stormtrooper mentality that sees the citizenry who oppose what's going on as enemies. And of course, for years now, we've talked about the way our politics are turning into a politics of friend and enemy, and how harmful that's been to dialogue, to compromise, and to our future, really, as a constitutional republic. But it seems to me, a very big part of what's going on here. Will Trump be able to use the Insurrection Act if he has recourse to it now? I'm not sure. It really all will depend ultimately, and it'll take a lot of time, on the Supreme Court. I think district judges in many places, as we've seen, will reject it just as they've rejected the National Guards. And so it's possible that we will not have soldiers surging in the town. But meanwhile, the stormtroops, ICE, and the Border Patrol have enormous forces to deploy around the country. As you know, I was shocked to read in the last few days that ICE has already doubled its size. They got this huge, big, beautiful bill addition to their budget, and they went from 10,000 roughly to 20,000 and plus in the country. And they are showing their stuff in Minneapolis, where they've just very quickly brought another, doubled the force there, which is now said to be 3,000 in a town that has 500 policemen, and would love to have more because so many people retired and resigned after the rough and divisive and difficult time that followed the tragic murder of George Floyd. In order to call out the troops, the actual army, into cities, all that Trump would have to do from his side of the view of the Insurrection Acts is proclaim that he's doing it and order a desisting of whatever disorder, insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, which is a gathering, of course, or conspiracy to deprive people of their constitutional rights. That's the language of the modern form of the Insurrection Acts, which were put together in the 1780s, 90s, and in the early 19th century, and then codified and recodified in the modern era. That then is a very big and, I think, difficult question. Now, in the surge in Minneapolis, as you may have seen, just yesterday, the day before, the mayor, the attorney general, and the governor, together with the ACLU, filed a suit under the 10th Amendment, saying that the intrusion of the federal officers in such numbers and with such behaviors is in fact an occupation, a hostile occupation of their state and their cities, St. Paul and Minneapolis and the other surrounding towns. And most of you hear the rhetoric voiced of the 10th Amendment, so you're somewhat familiar with it. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by the Constitution to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, which means to each of the states, or to the people. And this was that anti-federalist push that was so important to giving us the Bill of Rights. This happens to be one of the Bill of Rights that is essentially not a dead letter, but a mysterious letter that no one quite knows how to interpret. And if you were to ask, I'm skeptical that in the case of federal law enforcement officers um, whose numbers and behaviors are the problem, but whose basic right for a federal FBI agent or for that matter, an ICE agent or a Border Patrol agent or an alcohol and tobacco agent or a gun agent, their right to go into the states is essentially unquestioned and unquestionable. Of course, federal officers have a right to investigate, to arrest, and just as U.S. attorneys have a right to prosecute in the states. There's nothing wrong with that. It's part of our system, and it's a good part of our system that the FBI and others, when they're doing their proper jobs, can come into all the states. Where else are they going to go to do their work? The real charge here is the anarchy, disorder, and violence and violation of due process that's come with them. In other words, it's their behavior, and their numbers are certainly a huge problem. Many schools have shut, many schools are half empty. We're reading again and again how businesses, especially small businesses, are being harassed and are losing customers, as well as being investigated and required to do a lot of paperwork and having their employees gathered up. This is a real invasion of one of the nicer but also bluer parts of the United States. And I enormously with the governor, the mayor, and the attorney general and the ACLU in bringing this suit. But I am pessimistic that it will win for long. They may win over the district judge, although she's so far, her name is Catherine Menendez, is very, very careful and has postponed the requirement that the federal government answer the charges till I think 10 days from now. I mean, a significant or a week, a significant amount of time, given what's going on in Minneapolis. So she's a former federal public defender, so one would have a hunch that she'd be fairly liberal. But she's also, I gather, a very, very careful, arguably too cautious judge, and it's in front of her. Now let's talk for a minute and about the Minnesota Surge, and I hope I can give some people some advice about what to do and what the rights of the officers are in relation to us. And I guess I should start right out by saying uh, this whole question of being stopped in your car, something that has led to so much violence. I mean, if I could end this practice and have everything with cars done with cameras, if I were king, I would do it instantly because it's led to so much racist violence and so much non-racist violence, but just violence where cops, uh, apparently fearing something, are pull out a gun and shoot somebody in a car just for a stop over a headlight or a turning red or on a red light when they shouldn't have, or rolling through a stop sign and so on. Um, First lesson here is cops do have the right to ask you to get out of your car or to stay in your car. There's a case called Mims in 1977. Not an impressive opinion, but it was unanimous. And the basic idea is that there's some danger in the side of any road, and the cop standing at your door. And there's danger. The first danger they're focusing on is the cop, but the justification is that for the safety of all concerned, people can be asked to step out of a car when a cop stops you. And that does not have to be, if as long as, I mean, the cop is entitled to do that once he stops you, even though he may not have full probable cause to go further because of the unsafety of the situation itself. So uh, to poor Renée Good and everybody else, even in the rudest way, and you saw such an awful, rude, get the F out of this car by the first words from that agent who approached her door. But unfortunately, the law is you should get out of that car as soon as they say it. Come to a stop and just get out of the car. Otherwise, you're in some danger of a really difficult confrontation. And with these guys, probably a very violent one. So the supremacy clause clearly justifies sending federal enforcement into the states. We can't stop them. And I will all be very interested to see if Minnesota succeeds in saying, yes, but this intervention is beyond any reasonableness and is causing more violence, lots and lots of violence. The constitutional restraints in these, especially car-related stops, are the usual ones, especially the Fourth and Fifth Amendment. The searches and seizures have to involve probable cause. They have to be done with reasonableness and, in some cases, warrants. The difficulty that we're having now with these surges is that the warrants. Let me restate that the immigration police, if you will, the ICE people and the Border Patrol people have a very specific mandate and or remit and are supposed to be confined to that responsibility, namely immigration enforcement. Their warrants, in most cases, come from an administrative officer, an administrative judge called an immigration judge. Trump has gone through the immigration judge staff in Washington and elsewhere and is uh, firing many of them for overly generous decisions in the past. Their records are being looked at and installing his own obedient and harsh immigration judges. But they are not entitled to give you a warrant to enter your house or any private space. And that's why there's such emphasis, like with Carol, who's a Unitarian minister, on congregations delimiting what's the private space here and what's the public space. That's why this whole question of they're at the door, what do you say? Ask them to show you what they have. In most cases, they do not have a valid uh, federal judicial warrant or even state judicial warrant. What they have is an immigration judge authorization to go get somebody, and that person, if is in the cellar or whatever, they would have to have probable cause, knowing that that person is there, and they usually don't and are not allowed to bash down the doors, but they're bashing down doors left, right, and center in Minneapolis and breaking windows on cars. Um, the use of violence by cops in these cases, which I've already mentioned, and of course the violence that was imposed on Renée Good and her family by the shooting, the violence in a car stop, as in any stop, should is first of all limited by is it necessary and proper? Is it reasonable? And does the cop have reason to fear either for his or her own life or the lives of the public should there be a flight by somebody who's heavily armed? In just last year, we had a decision on how you evaluate the reasonableness of policemen resorting to violence in a car stop case called Barnes against Felix. And Barnes's mother, Barnes was killed, and his mother sued. And it was another, and we've got a whole raft of these cases where a cop put your hands on the steering wheel, but give me your registration. The guy reaches for his registration, and the cop misinterprets that and shoots the person. Crawl on the ground and raise your hands at the same time. And literally, a cop in a famous case shot somebody on the ground that way. Again and again, whatever you say about the psychology and stupidity, really, of what happens, these things are extremely dangerous to civilians, which is why we all should be so polite and obedient, even in facing the rudest possible cop. But the cops are held to a real standard here, and what's going on with ICE and the Border Patrol is they clearly, if they're trained in the standards and read the Justice Department policies on this, they're clearly just ignoring them and putting them aside. My own hunch is that it comes, as some commentators have said, from the movement from true borderlands. Most of these ICE and Border Patrol agents work in the Southwest. There is a thinner line across the Canadian border, and there are customs agents in ports and airports and so on. But ICE agents like Jonathan Ross, based in St. Paul, are fairly few and far between, and they're used to a kind of cowboy existence, riding big, heavy trucks across, or big, pickup trucks chasing down some poor guy trying to jump a fence across a desert-like land. And they're not usually under such observation as they are when they're in cities like Chicago or Minneapolis. And I think they've been getting away with things for a long time. But it's a lot harder for a undocumented immigrant to bring them to account. And we're now seeing it in videos because of people like Renée Good who are volunteering to video and risk something in doing it. And of course, the cops have treated the videographers, if you will, the volunteers, horribly. For instance, can you follow a cop convoy? Yes, you can. But the cop convoys in Minneapolis have been suddenly jamming on their brakes and causing rear enders. They've been, in some cases, figuring out who's behind them and going to the house of that person and then trying to intimidate them. They've jumped out of the car and taken pictures of people and then identified them and talked to them by their name to suggest a kind of fear in them. I mean, they're really behaving like, as I say, stormtroopers. Um, Another problem that we have with the Renée Good case is that, and by all appearances, and I think now pretty clearly, uh, Ms. Good, having with her wife Rebecca, having dropped the young child of her three children at school, took on the role as she drove of watching out for ice, came to a place where there apparently had been some kind of interaction, and perhaps an ice car had gotten stuck in the snow. That's in one of the narratives. And then did this impeding driving gesture of turning her car across, partly on the bike lane and partly on the first lane of a one-way street. And it was at that point a street that had a lot of cars in it because there was a lot of ice interaction going on. And as you know, the ice cars themselves are unidentified and you can't really see what they are until they turn on their sirens. There's no question, it seems to me, that for one reason or another, she was obstructing what ICE was trying to do in driving through. She was doing it in the nicest possible way. And we see in the videos that she waves people on, including ICE people. But in a strictly legal sense, she was impeding the progress of their work and thus could be charged with obstruction of federal officers, which is it can be a misdemeanor, but it often will be raised to a felony and has pretty serious consequences, going up to, in some cases, 5 years. There are other aspects of different statutes that say 8 years if it's conspiracy. And as a legal observer, I don't know. This may have been talked about as something people should do. It's a very brave and risky thing to do, though, and in some cases will lead to, one hopes, charges, and in some cases to violent confrontations, which is what happened to her. Um, I've already said how troubling car stops, police stops are, and how often and tragically they lead to awful shootings. I want to talk for a little bit about how you evaluate them. In Felix and Barnes, the case last year, which was a killing of a man named Barnes, the Supreme Court, in evaluating that killing, dealt with a conflict in the circuits, the federal circuits that preside over the district courts of the federal system. And that conflict was between several circuits where the rule was to look at the entire context or the totality of circumstances. For instance, what happened an hour before? Was it a long chase? Do we know that somebody is a fleeing felon? Was there a bank robber? To look at that entire set of circumstances in evaluating the violent response of the cop who shot at the person they were chasing or the person they stopped. And other circuits, which govern the district judges under them, which said that the moment of threat was the point at which the cop's behavior should be evaluated for reasonableness and appropriateness. At the moment when the cop pulled the trigger, did that cop have a reasonable fear of violence probably towards himself or towards others, such that it would justify a shooting or use of lethal violence on the part of the cop. And what the Supreme Court said was that they favored, and that is now the national rule, a totality of circumstances or contextual judgment that looks at a wide range of possible behaviors, like was the thing I just mentioned. Was there some crime that's been committed that a person is fleeing? Do we have reason to think the person is armed, et cetera, in the whole context? They may even know who the person is in terms of their record and so on. Having said that, the totality of circumstances still leads to these situations in which things are moving very, very quickly, as in the killing of Renée Good, and cops are making very, very quick judgments of whether or not they're at risk or the public is at risk. I noticed going over the videos myself that the time that elapses between get the hell out of the car, get the F out of the car, and the actual shooting by Jonathan Ross is something like 16 seconds. And Jonathan Ross during that time is coming in front of her car and clearing it, as we all know, so that he may have been sideswiped it seemed very gently as far as I could tell. But he was definitely not about to be run over when he started pulling the trigger, and certainly not the second and third shots. So in evaluating this, the question is the totality of circumstances, but typically under very compressed emergency judgments being made by a cop. The other thing that seems to me really important in this particular case is his background. Many of us have thought that this surge in recruitment and enlistment and deputizing of ICE and Border Patrol people with the millions upon millions of dollars that's being thrown at these forces would lead to a lot of untrained officers. I think that's true, and I think their behavior shows it. But it's not the case in Jonathan Ross's case. He served 6 years in the military, including deployment to Iraq. He was on the front lines. He served 8 years in the Border Patrol down in the Southwest, I think, and he has now served 10 years in immigration and customs enforcement. So 18 years in immigration enforcement or law enforcement, and 6 years before that with firearms in wars. This is not a person who didn't get lots and lots of firearms training. But most of you will have noticed that in a case called Munoz, Guatemala, very unusual name, I should say, a man was in the country having been convicted several years before of sexual assault on a minor. And I don't know if that sexual assault is statutory rape or actual pedophilia, of a very young child. But whatever it was, he had a pretty serious and deportable conviction and had an order of, he should have left the country. He had an order of deportation, which he had evaded. They found out where he was, which was in one of the suburbs of Minneapolis where there's a strong Latino population. And ICE went after him. And I'm not sure what they knew about his work or his address or what have you. But Ross was on a team of agents with several cars that caught up with him and chased him. And in Ross's case, his car actually blocked Munoz, Guatemala from moving so that they stopped the escape chase. And then Ross jumped out of his car with other agents and went to the Munoz, Guatemala car, and Munoz, Guatemala kept his window shut, as many people will, and his door locked, so they couldn't easily get in. Ross then moved to the back window of this car and used one of those electric punches to break the back window, reached in with his right arm, and seems to have sought to open the door to take Munoz, Guatemala out, or possibly grabbing Munoz, Guatemala on the shoulders or the neck or something, and then somehow shot Munoz, Guatemala several times with a taser. But Munoz, Guatemala jammed his foot on the accelerator and drove at a pretty high rate. You can see a film of it for 12 seconds, and he went about 100 yards, which is it's not highway speed, but it's a high school, not very good high school sprinter speed to go 100 yards, and tried to weave his way, or to use a Trumpian term, so that he could throw Ross off the car. This happened last June. Munoz, Guatemala, was convicted in December, really not very long ago. Ross testified. My hunch is that Ross suffers from a pretty serious case of PTSD about that. He got some 30 or 40 stitches. He got his head banged on the pavement. And he clearly also suffers, it seems to me, from a degree of sort of aggression in trying to stop somebody. There were a lot of cars there. There were other agents there. He did not have to grab onto the guy inside the car. And to me, at least, that's an important part of the background here. That leads to the question of, quote unquote, by J.D. Vance, absolute immunity. And I think you all know by now that there isn't absolute immunity, there's qualified immunity. The civil immunity of federal officers from lawsuits is much, much greater than the civil immunity of your Massachusetts or New York policemen or troopers or what have you. And that would be a much more difficult thing to recover money. And I assume Ross is not a wealthy guy in any case, but to recover money from the federal government is in a case like this almost impossible. What's been raised as this notion of absolute immunity by Vance and supported by lots and lots of people on the right is the notion that these officers should be absolutely immune. And they absolutely, as you've heard before, and I'm not the first to say it, are not. They do have qualified immunity. They're going about federal work. They are law enforcement officers, and they're entitled to be protected from suits if what they did was, one, in the line of duty, two, necessary and proper, and three, if their judgment in this was in the range of ordinary policemen of ordinary judgment with ordinary reactions. And I think many of us think that his was not. Um, I salute the Attorney General and the District Attorney, Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, and Mary Moriarty, the District Attorney, for showing some resolve here. The feds are saying, well, we're not going to cooperate you the way that is absolutely routine in these kind of events, so that both sides can contribute whatever they have in interviewing and so on. And so we're not cooperating, and there's been some arrogant talk about that will stop any reasonable chance of prosecution. My answer to that is you don't often see murder cases where there's videotape from all angles of the actual shooting and so on. And I think that Minnesota will be able to proceed with an indictment uh, pretty promptly on the basis of interviews and videotapes and so on, even without possession of the truck. The other interesting thing is that federal officers do have a right, and it's an absolute right, to remove their cases from state prosecution to federal courts. When they do that removal, they bring with them the state law and state prosecutors. So that would mean that Mary Moriarty or Keith Ellison or people in their offices would be once, if Ross chooses to go to a federal court, he has an absolute right to get a federal judge, and then but he would not get a federal prosecutor. He would get arguably a federal defender, but he would get the Minnesota prosecutor, the Minneapolis prosecutor, or the Attorney General's office coming after him with the evidence they had. And my own hunch, and I talked to my friend David Rudenstein at length about this the other day, it would depend a lot on the federal judge, but I would think there'd be a significant chance that the federal judge would take motions to subpoena or to give access to the truck and the other federal evidence, so that the lack of a federal investigation will not stop this from going forward as a prosecution. Steve Laddick, my old student, was quoted in the Times yesterday as saying, well, they can indict him, but it'll be very hard to convict him. That's probably true. It's hard to convict cops in these cases because the compression of reaction time and judgment time is so fast that a lot of people on juries and a lot of judges would say, well, in that rushed moment of judgment, he thought with reason that he was in peril and thus pulled the trigger. I think, as somebody said, that the moral judgment to me is very clear. He is not a good cop. He didn't behave like a reasonable cop. He didn't follow training. He was close to the back of the car, like 2 or 3 feet. And then he was really right on the front of the car. And those apparently are the very first things they teach cops. Stay away from the possibility of the car moving backwards or forwards. So he made a massive mistake in that sense. And he didn't seem to show any intuition about her very friendly gestures of saying hello and so on. On the other hand, she backed up, so the tires were turned clearly away from him. But when she turned to go the other way, the tires would have passed through a motion, which at a very small point would have been facing him, even as he stepped aside. So I would say he is, to my mind, utterly morally contemptible and condemnable, and that he's just an incompetent cop who used massively excessive and cruel violence. But I'm not sure he'll be convicted, and a lot of cops aren't in situations like this. With that, I think I'll open it up and see what kinds of questions and comments and ideas we have. And Carol's going to be maneuvering through the questions that we do have. I know there have been some coming up that I've seen in front of me.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So, well, since we've sort of been in the land of the good case for a little bit here, let's stay there for a second. Related to use of force and sort of how these cases go, have there been any recently decided cases related to, or any cases that are making their way through related to other um, killings from ICE agents in the last couple of months? Because wasn't it 30 something people in the last year that?
ICE hasn't killed that many. I think they've killed 4 or 5, and
Oh,
they
okay.
but they've used gunshots, something in the teens or 20s, and so and as indeed they used one yesterday. I don't know. Does anybody who's listening know of a case? I mean, I've been paying a lot of attention to this, and I do not know of a case that has made its way
Hmm.
through. There's one of the things I should perhaps have added is that there in the case last year of Barnes against Felix, when they decided that at the Supreme Court that totality of circumstances would be the way in which you would judge the cops' behavior and their reasonableness in using force. Um, there was mention, but just mention, of the question of police created jeopardy. In other words,
Hmm.
if a cop acts very irresponsibly and creates a very dangerous situation, does that put the cop in jeopardy in a different position from the cop who is following training, keeping away from the front and back of a car, politely saying "step out, please," et cetera, and using restraint? And it's clear to me that Jonathan Ross, in these two instances of Munoz, Guatemala, and now Good, has endangered both himself and, in one case, killed somebody, and in the other case, provoked this, fight or flight kind of reaction from Munoz, Guatemala. So I'd
Yeah.
say he's a very bad cop. But I don't know of any ICE. I mean, there obviously have been some police convictions. We know about them, starting with Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis is the most famous recent one, or somewhat recent one. But no, I don't think, to my knowledge, I have not seen it. I'm very concerned, Carol. I mean, David Rudenstein passed on a comment from a friend in Minneapolis who went into a pizza parlor to have lunch with somebody, and two ICE guys, according to this report, came in, and I have not seen this in the Star Tribune or anywhere else. Two ICE guys come in and people boo them. Uh, the ICE guys then turn around and leave in a huff, and as they leave, they toss a pellet of gas at the whole restaurant
Hmm.
and just go off, utterly with impunity and defiance. I think they're behaving really badly. And I think if they were doing this in smaller instances, less massively in New York or Massachusetts or Minnesota or a lot of other places, there would be some serious complaints. But I gather that the complaints are just being put aside and paid no attention to.
Hmm. Well, so there was a couple of questions that were in the ballpark related to your conversation about traffic stops and policing. Is what are the what's the legal story in terms of people's ability to ask for ID, to ask for any kind of something before complying and getting out of the car?
Before complying and getting it, because you could be facing a bogus arrest, and especially
Hmm.
if they're unidentified, and that's ambiguous. I would say.
Hmm.
It seems to me, as a matter of due process, it certainly is right to say, why are you doing this? And I think you should say that. What did I do, officer? But it needs to be done. I hate to say it, even with a very rude officer, it needs to be done with a kind of deference. Can you tell me what I did? Am I under arrest? Am I free to go? Would you mind identifying yourself? And in
Hmm.
many, many cases, they will not identify themselves. And to my knowledge, there is nowhere to force that out of them, even after the fact, although it may, in the totality of circumstances later on, show irresponsible and bad policing.
Hmm.
If there's some violence, but you do not want violence. But I know exactly what you mean. When I saw, I can't, that Oz Turk or whatever her name is, the graduate student at Tufts being arrested in the video in Boston, in Medford, Massachusetts. It was clear to me by the look on her face that she thought she was being assailed by a little mini gang of rapists or something. I mean, she was just terrified when they first show up and don't ident and just usher her away. And as you can see that as she's taken across the street and put in a car, she sort of gets the scene. This is immigration police. But I would think any of us would react as, what the hell's going on here? And of course, that could lead to violence too, because so many people in America are armed.
Yeah. And in a similar ballpark, there was a question about what are and this may be outside of your scope. Maybe this is a question about like police procedure, but uh, are they allowed to shoot at a car that's leaving a scene if that,
So
and sort of how does
that's
that
where I
work?
think the totality of circumstances is a good rule. There are a number of cases, especially, I mean, we've seen these in TV shows during Prohibition, when the shoot 'em outs were more even more common than now in
Mm,
certain sectors, um, where somebody gets killed in that exact context. The federal policy now only allows it when there's a danger to the cop or to the public, and there are cases, but they're very, very rare, and I think everybody understands that, where the getaway, even with an identifiable car, the possibility of a chase, the getaway is dangerous. Where this is somebody who's berserk and is going to harm who knows who,
yeah,
either on the
plow into
road or with
pedestrians or
guns. And
whatever.
they can shoot in that case, but it's a rare case. My son, who lives in LA, was saying on the phone the other night that the policy in LA seems to be to simply not speed after chases, but use drones and helicopters and stuff to slowly, as it were, chase and not cause the kind of car accidents they're caused by chases.
Hmm.
No, they're not supposed to shoot bullets at cars, and unless they are justified by danger to the public from the flight um, and of course danger to themselves if the car is heading at them.
Yeah. I have a couple questions that are sort of connected. So, I saw in the news today that Renée Good's family has put together their legal case, and they
Right.
hired the same law firm that represented George Floyd's family. Um, and previous to that, the various members, spokespeople for the government, have made statements about her intent and character, and that parallels behavior that has happened by state and federal officials against various civil rights era people and activists, and all through. Um, I guess I'm wondering sort of what's the legal context there? Like what recourse does her family have as they're seeking legal action? Does the fact that her character was impugned change any of that versus if that hadn't happened and it had just been a shooting that was videotaped? You know what I mean?
It's not. I mean, bad as we judge the behavior of Jonathan Ross, obviously it's not. It's not his fault, even though he may, who knows, he may cheer it that President Trump and
Right.
Kristi Noem and so on are immediately maligning her, calling her a domestic terrorist, which is some kind of bizarre category that they've cooked up as just sort of like communists, we'll call whatever, we'll call these people some bad name associated with something or other that may not exist at all. The likely, when I was reading about the suit and the lawyer, my initial reaction, and others may know better. I'm not an expert on these so-called Bivens suits, but the a suit against him for denying her a suit against the federal government for one of its agents denying her civil right to life sounds like a very plausible suit. However, there the immunity is not absolute, but it's close to absolute. There, you do not get settlements in those cases the way you do in state cases. George Floyd's was a state case, and in state cases, many deprivation of civil rights by killings and violence and so on are rewarded uh, in nearly all states with settlements if the the trial goes that way or the negotiation goes that way. But the feds are in a much different position, and I think it's very unlikely there'll be a settlement there. Um, on the question, could her family bring some kind of libel suit or something? I'm very skeptical of that with
Mhm.
these these are high federal officers engaging in politics essentially, and there's a lot of leeway in the First Amendment for that.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Um,
should I help you look at the thing or
no, it's okay. I'm copying and pasting them over and just sort of squishing stuff together as much as I can. So there was a question about for ICE. What are their rights for acting against people interfering with their work, right? Like, so
for
I'm
impeding
just
or obstructing?
yeah. So I'm just going to
Yeah,
guess that the you
yeah.
what
So
you mentioned that
yeah,
they
so just to go over it again, let's talk about what we should do if we are inclined. You have a couple of questions from people saying, "What should we do in Massachusetts and New York to protest?" Or if we know ICE is in the neighborhood, and we're not getting the kind of ICE surges that they're getting in Minneapolis or Chicago uh,
they're coming though.
or yeah, but they may be coming. And we're not seeing big forces in Hudson, New York, or over in Pittsfield or something. And the answer is you have a clear First Amendment right to videotape. You have, moreover, a clear First Amendment right to voice your objection. You have a right to blow a whistle. Um, they have a right to say, stand back a certain distance. That distance might be adjudged if they hit you or something as what's a reasonable distance. The
Hmm.
noise you make, I think they probably have a right. They cannot charge you with intimidating them with noise, but it's possible that if there's some conversation or inquiry going on, that they could say that your noise is an interference. But as a general matter, if you keep some distance, your filming is as of right, your talking is as of right. You don't have to be polite, although I would urge you to be. Et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there are numerous films. There was one in Brewster, New York, just a few days, some days ago, where a woman, over the course of several minutes that she's filming, gets more and more frustrated about give me your dame tu nombre, señor. She's trying to help this poor, intimidated guy who's being put in the car, and he never gives her his nombre, so she can't call his family or anything.
Oh, oh,
She's
oh.
obviously bilingual, and at a certain point, it's almost, I mean, it's terribly sad, but it's almost funny to watch her behavior because she starts moving her language. So by the end, when they're driving away, it's all the F word and all these kind of dirty words thrown at them. Uh, I don't think that really helps. I mean, I think you're more likely to get through to them by saying, this is not the America that George Washington or, Abraham Lincoln wanted to construct and help build. Um, Immigrants have helped America, that kind of thing. I mean, I don't think this is, I mean, it's what they're doing to work in America is, I mean, what they're doing to construction, housing, roofing, nursing homes, right? Food. I mean, he is savaging our economy in the long run, a la Brexit, with both tariffs and these expulsions of thousands of people, and we're going to pay for it because we're going to have
Yeah.
jobs going wanting and all sorts of bad things are going to happen because of this, and bad things having nothing to do with the cruelty and the horror and the loneliness of being separated from your kids by you getting deported and so on.
There's a couple of questions, a couple more car questions that I'm going to pivot to sort of a different uh, section of other stuff that's come in the chat. Um, Questions about, like them tossing, like they did in the pizza shop that you mentioned, tossing tear gas into cars, putting things up tailpipes, a variety of, causing harm, but n not necessarily fatal harm.
Breaking windows, breaking down
Yeah.
doors. They're doing a lot of things that in a more discrete setting with a more responsive federal government, they would have an ombudsman. You can complain. There are offices for these things. They've been gutted by President Trump and his minions, and they're just not responding. The usual. I mean, Kash Patel is in charge of the investigation. In some sense, that's fine, but we know he's not going to do an investigation. And the Justice Department people have a whole office for police violence investigations are totally shut down, and that's why we're
Mhm.
getting these resignations and stuff. No, they're paying no mind. They are really paying no mind. They're going to pay mind to the polls and the votes, and they're not going to pay mind in the normal way that the citizenry is seen as something the police should serve. What do they say on the LA cars? Serve and protect or something? I mean,
Mhm.
you see that all. I mean, we know the ideal is always far from the real in our lives and in government offices as in so many things, but this is like the real is just totally scornful,
Mhm.
happily, cruelly scornful, as far as I can see, of the ideal. And that's why it really seems to me, I don't think fascism is a helpful word in politics, but it seems to me it's inchoate fascism. It's these guys have got it, they got the right instincts to become, where are we to let them to become, real fascists, and they're behaving like fascists in picking on this group. And now they're turning from the group, just as the Niemöller, that famous prose poem that ministers like first they came for the communists, then they come for the trade unionists, then they go for the Jew, and when they come for me, they've already gone, they were, well, when they come for us, we won't all be what Niemöller worried about. There'll be plenty of us. But
Mhm.
that's the hopeful thing. But they are taking their mandate, their win in some of the elections, and just as we know, Trump has taken that just to an absurd length of destructiveness towards our basic constitutional system.
There was a question in the chat related to ICE seems to expect people they encounter who are not driving a car to be carrying ID at all times. Is that legal?
And you've probably seen there was a lovely Somali young woman who stood up to them and said, with a strong accent, so they could tell she was born elsewhere. Where were you born? They kept saying. She just kept saying, "I'm an American citizen. I don't have to carry ID." And
Hmm.
that, of course, is true. These things, though, are all titrated by the amount of courage or risk embracing or avoidance you have. I mean, at a certain point, cops may be asking you to do something unreasonable that you probably should comply. I mean, it's an outrageous thing for a police person to come up to your door and say, "Get the fuck out of here." That the way we see in that video. It's outrageous. I'm paying your salary, all those kind of things you might say back. You work for us, serve and protect. You may have it right that I was impeding your work. Okay, ask me to step out, put me under arrest, but do it politely, identifying yourself and so on.
Yeah,
Is a
follow the
state
rules.
issued real ID proof of citizenship? Somebody says. I think it is, because you got to show a birth certificate
Hmm.
or a passport, I think. Uh, I say this as a guy who got rejected for 2 or 3 years over in Hudson, New York, because I had my passport said Thomas R. Gerety, and my birth certificate had the full name of my uncle who was killed in the last days of the Second World War. They said, well, these are inconsistent, but no, it's proof.
I took my
That's a
father-in-law to
good
the
practical question, by the way. I
yeah.
appreciate practical questions.
I took my father-in-law to the RMV to get his license done a couple of years ago, and I saw two grown women at different times sobbing over trying to get the right paperwork to get their
Oh
real
my God.
IDs.
Yeah.
It's
I
awful.
was all the way through and they told me, nope, I had the check written and everything. And they, no, you don't do this inconsistency. But now they've loosened up. Now I got through.
So I was
Yeah.
gonna ask a
Do you say, I just want to mention that Ken Ross has had several comments here, and he has one saying, were it not for video.
Mhm.
Ken, you can comment if I've got this wrong, but were it not for video, there would be a lot of denialism or lies about what happened. And that really is true. Were it not for witnessing, were it not for video, I mean, the age of AI may be the age of fake videos and stuff. But to my knowledge, we are still able to, prove things by getting people to, or at least give reasonable approaches to the truth by showing videos and talking about them. My friend, Joe, there's one from Pittsburgh there that I just missed as it came up and down. Do you see that in the most recent ones? I'll keep looking as they come up on the screen. Yeah, and there's a immigrant defense network. Stand back and run a video, somebody says. Yeah, I
Oh,
think that's
yeah.
a good thing.
So, d if you don't mind, can we blow out just a little bit to sort of the federal and state conflicts in court here?
Yeah.
And Trump today said something about we're not going to make any payments to states that have sanctuary cities and all this kind of stuff. Some more, rattling of bars, and
Oh,
then
yeah.
um, sort of talking about how he's going to punish the state of Minnesota because it's corrupt and yada yada. Um, what is the how does that work? What is the inter how what
We're
are the
learning. I mean,
yeah.
the Harvard and Massachusetts and some other places, the recent thing on the wind turbines. I mean, there is an argument that what an order from the president, who has a lot of executive discretion and enormous, as the Brennan Center's Elizabeth Goitein has shown over and over again, tremendous emergency powers. And as someone said in one of the cases, emergency powers breed emergencies or fake emergencies, which is what we're seeing here. Yeah, these are good claims of irrationality, unreasonableness, denial of due process because they're retaliatory, just like a retaliatory firing in labor law.
Mhm.
And whether, and many district judges are embracing them as they are appealed up. Many of us saw the New York Times article this week about Trump's favorite appeals court judges. They aren't they're not controlling appeals courts yet, although maybe in the Fifth Circuit they do. But um, there's a good argument there. It's one that can win and probably will win in many instances because clearly what's going on, it would seem to me, is uh, attacking the states that, I mean, Waltz called him weird, et cetera, et cetera. There's just attacking Minnesota is attacking something he's has the kind of spite for. And what he said about the Somali immigrants, who, by the way, very sensibly seem to have, in great numbers, gone for green cards and then citizenship rather than waiting. Somebody, there was a report from the jails, the detainment centers, from a young man and a slightly older woman. I don't know if you saw it on the videotape. And they said in jail, almost everybody was Latino, and they didn't once mention Somali people. And that's interesting. And I think it suggests that, as the Times and others have reported, the majority of the Somalis in Minnesota are citizens of the United States and thus are well defended, even though they may be jumped on, beaten up. All sorts of things can happen, but they are, in the end, are going to prevail with their IDs as citizens.
And then there's a variety of questions related to Congress in the chat and sort of as the makers of our laws. Let's imagine that they wanted to do something. That's a
Yeah, well,
imagine.
maybe the House will, or maybe we'll get both. Yeah.
What would be the thing they could do?
Well, they could one first thing, let's really restrict revise all the emergency powers resolutions, put them on a short leash, 2 months, 1 month, 3 months, need, someone come back to Congress. I mean, two, and this goes into foreign affairs, really uh, assert, somehow change the immigration laws such, and the conservatives are all against the administrative bodies doing this, so do it in Congress. Uh, Deportation should have very strictly guaranteed due process. There's a lot of things a congressional majority, including a more than 60-person majority in the Senate, which seems very unlikely, could do, because Trump in these next 3 years or 2.5 years can veto almost anything we put before him. But they can start, they can cut off funds. I mean, there are a lot of things they can do. That big, beautiful bill with its ugly consequences for our economy and for our people is a shameful thing, really, in this time, both in overspending and in spending in the wrong direction. So there's a lot Congress could do, even by balking like a baseball player and just saying, no, we're not going to do that. But uh, we really need a different president, and we need a different majority with that president. Okay, Carol,
Um,
I want to go over because I think there I may have left some ambiguity just as a teacher. Uh, the the removal power that is the fact that as a matter of law, any federal officer, military, law enforcement, I think even bureaucratic or inspectors or forest people and so on, has a power to remove a criminal charge that's related to his work to a district judge. That arose because in the early days of the Republic, in the excise taxes at the ports and the seizing of ships and so on, there was tremendous local prejudice against the very few government officers who were exercising taxing or other powers, and they would be in front of a kind of mob jury, like the segregated South, if you were an African American or something. In other words, there's tremendous prejudice against a federal officer who'd made a hard decision and harmed someone locally. And thus, we began to get these arguments that you should be able to take your case to a federal court. And all of that, and you can just imagine how this worked during the Reconstruction period. There were statutes that were codified that were stronger. And in the civil rights period, again, the statutes were recodified. So there's a good purpose for the removal power. And I don't think that's any kind of a threat to the possibility of a state prosecution of a federal cop who is irresponsible and in his or her use of lethal force. So I just want to be clear about that. If a case is brought, Ross would probably say, I want it brought in federal court and he'll get a federal defender from what we've read about the Justice Department. But he will also get the Minnesota prosecutors, and a federal judge is probably as likely as any state judge to be fair. There's a question about a jury. People have in Minnesota, they have a right to waive a jury if the judge agrees and the prosecutor agrees. But that is presumably favored when there's been a lot of bad publicity. And certainly that's the case here. So he might say, I want a bench trial, a trial just in front of a judge, and that might happen. But if he gets a trial on a prosecution like this, I suspect it'll be a fair trial. It'll be hard to convict him because of the things we've said, but I think it'll be a fair trial. And as I said to you, he's morally, in my view, blatantly condemnable.
is another sort of ICE agent process question. In reporting, it seems that many of the new ICE agents haven't been vetted. Some have criminal records that, by guidelines, they shouldn't be able to have and be agents, yada yada. Is there any legal process to challenge that practice? Who is that a
It's this
Congress
is
thing?
this you know the, those of us who worship, sort of sentimentalize their Constitution. We not as long as the president will pardon anybody he feels like pardoning or
Right.
sends him money or does something he cheers. Um, and not as long as he's got people in the Justice Department who are just doing his bidding rather than, uh, conscientiously evaluating cases and charges on the basis of the law. We had that talk with Aziz Huq about the dual state, and in some regards, the government of the United States is not a dual state at this point. It's a monistic state. It's going the high levels of our government are captured by people who are disrespectful of even corporate law. I mean, they're disrespectful of communications law. They'll do it the hard way or do it the easy way. I mean, they're disrespectful of international law. We want Greenland or what have you. I mean, it's an astonishing seizure of the sort of governing sort of norms of the whole of our whole tradition. And sure, we've done a lot of bad things in our tradition, but we've there's always been, that the joke about hypocrisy as the what virtues that what is that line about from Oscar Wilde about
Oh,
the
shoot.
tribute that vice pays to virtue is hypocrisy. I mean, they're not paying much of a tribute to the virtues to the civic virtues of really upholding law-abidingness, due process, politeness,
Mhm.
respect for others who disagree with you, respect even for people who may not have the documents that entitle them to stay here when you've caught up with them. But it's a charade in a way because their whole thing, and Trump has just said it in the last few days, rape the usual that rapist murderers line he said in the first speech at Trump Tower. It's all coming back. He's saying it again and again. Uh,
Um, there was a couple of questions about pardons that just came in the chat connected to this. By selecting to go to federal court, would that,
no,
if he did that, would that allow for a presidential pardon?
no.
Okay.
These removals in these cases, and they're rare, but you get used to them in law school reading them. These are simply cases in which, because of some concern about unfairness or prejudice of the people of one state versus another, and so on and so forth, there's a right of removal, not just for federal officers, but in other interstate litigations. And that right of removal brings with it, in many cases, the law that is appropriate to the contract or whatever it is we're
It's
arguing
still
about.
it's
Or
still
the
state
crime. And
charges, not
that
federal.
state
Yeah.
law, along with state officers, goes in front of a federal judge, and the jury would be picked, I think, according to the rules of federal procedure and so on and so forth. But there'd be real deference to Minnesota law at that point, and so and the conviction would be a Minnesota conviction, and not a federal pardonable by the president conviction.
A big picture question for you, and I hope you have your tea leaves nearby. In the question was, in the end, can we count on SCOTUS from keeping us from falling into a full constitutional crisis? I won't hold you to this.
Yeah, no. Well, I mean, I was really heartened to see that they didn't reverse April Perry's decision on Chicago and so on. I I think we're gonna have some good news about birthright citizenship. I'd put a few bucks on that, and I'd put some bucks on the tariffs case because it was such a hostile oral argument. I mean, they clearly it was hard to find anybody who had anything good to say about the president just throwing tariffs hither and yon.
Mm.
Um, I think you can count on the Supreme Court to at this point, to give way on a lot, but not everything. I mean, it's kind of like Lincoln's thing. You can fool some of the people some of the time, but not everybody all of the time. I think they're not going to give away the store entirely, and that may give us all time to get a new House majority and even possibly a much improved Senate. Um, but but no, I think we've learned our lesson about those, especially Carol, not so much people your age, but my age, meaning growing up to adulthood in the 60s and early 70s, and finishing graduate school or law school in my case. There was, a lot of criticism of the court. Well, they messed up on this and they were prejudiced, this time and that time, but also tremendous sense of we're moving in the right direction. And this court is at best holding the line on some things, and we'll see on birthright citizenship. But I think they will hold the line on that, and certainly that's a baseline for us in
And
America. It's right in
connected
the
to that, there was
Constitution.
a question about if Congress were to change, its mix, is it possible to impeach any Supreme Court justices who's how'd they say it, who gave too much power to Trump and all presidents going forward to not be accountable for anything they do while president? Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Wait a
Presidential
minute.
immunity.
To impeach Supreme Court justices, did you say?
Hmm.
Same thing. You need a big majority to impeach anybody.
Yeah.
Albert Anderson, did you see that one, Carol, the philosopher friend,
Oh
said,
yeah.
read that one about morality.
Blah, 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 blah. Ross is morally reprehensible, whatever the legal judgment. Could you say a few words about that distinction, legal versus moral, for the benefit of those who might not have thought about that difference?
Yeah, I mean, people talk about legislating morality as if it were a bad thing, but a lot of legislation has some kind of moral intuition or basis to it or argument to it. Uh, uh, in I am simply saying, from my point of view as a person outside of the state who sees these videos and things, that this is bad policing. And I know that from commentary that other police, that retired and older policemen, senior police men and women say it's bad policing. So the first thing I'd say is there's bad in the sense of incompetent or irresponsible. And then I think there's a third degree murder in Minnesota uses the language of depraved indifference to human life in the use of weapons. And I don't know if I would imagine he'll get, if he gets charged, it'll be the notch down of manslaughter, which is something like reckless indifference. But it looks to me like, the guy is a little depraved, that he's trigger happy. And it may be, as somebody suggested in the thing, and I suggested, it may be a PTSD. Could be from the war, could be from, I mean, it just seems he's a very aggressive, quick to jump either with his body or with his gun on somebody. And jumping on this gentle, poor woman with a little kid just dropped off at school. And I mean, it's just, she smiled and said, "I'm not mad at you," right? I mean, it just moments before. It's no, I think what he did was plainly immoral and plainly incompetent. I think it was illegal, but we will see. To do, it may be held to be illegal, and then Minnesota can sentence him, and the president can't pardon him. Um, but I think it'll be several notches down from second degree murder. I mean, obviously it wasn't first degree murder, which is to say, deliberated over planned murder. It was spontaneous.
Going back to the interaction between state and federal governments, there was a question about how can states withhold taxes from the federal government? There's many states that pay in more than they receive back from the federal government, and if Trump,
Massachusetts and New York and California. Yeah,
yeah,
correct.
if Trump is using those funds as a bargaining chip, and that's suddenly on the table, like what does that open
No,
up?
you'd have to win it on a straight out retaliation. There is no way that either, I grew up mildly influenced by the Catholic worker anarchist movement, where
Me
Dorothy
too.
Day, the famous Dorothy Day, said, "Don't pay your tax." But they had very low bank accounts. But the first thing when you don't pay your taxes is they garnish your whatever money you got. And at the state level, the banking system would make that essentially impossible. In other words, if the state has most of the resources are coming from corporations and individuals in any case. But if a state tried to sort of embargo that and not give it to the feds, I think they'd just be nonviolently overcome immediately, and I don't know, probably punished in some way. But uh, but no, I think you can get them. I mean, I think the way to go is commentary and litigation about discriminatory enforcement of the laws. And we've seen that in some of these research funds, and in some of the research cases where funds have been denied to this state system or that private university. And
Hmm.
Harvard is one initially on that ground. But as Harvard has recognized, and we've all read, there's a lot of discretion in the federal government for the following year. They may be accused of retaliation this year. Next year, they just don't grant your grants. Um, I think for all of these things, the power of self-interest will start to bear down on Trump and his supporters. The power of our economy is not going to be doing very well. Our costs are going up. Today, NPR led with the rating of the Chinese universities, and Harvard being the only university in the top 10, and itself falling down on research, effectively an evaluation of scientific research, saying that China is now way ahead of us in terms of publication in the best journals, and that's sure. I mean, it's a Sputnik call. It's saying the cutting off funding to research is the last thing we ought to be doing. So I think the secular side of winning, the amoral side, just the self-interested side, is going to defeat these guys.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left. There are some questions that I'm sorry I did not have a chance to get to in the chat. I wanted to sort of give you a chance there's lots of thank yous also that you should know, Tom. Lots of
Thank
thank
you.
yous
Well,
here
thank you
eh,
for, yeah,
from
we're all.
folks. Do you want to have a last word here? And you
No,
started
I
with some
just, I
uplift. Do
mean,
you want to?
I would say people always say when they listen to these things, well, do you offer us some hope? Some people say, well, you're too pessimistic. Things are bad. America has turned in a bad direction in its governing powers. I think most of us recognize that. And I think, as I say, I don't think the word fascist is helpful in politics. It's too inflammatory. But for those of us who study politics or the organization of governments, it does seem to me it's getting, we're there. We're not getting there. We're there. We have a fascist leadership in the Republican Party in the executive side. And we have, as we know, a supine leader, just sort of lie down and do whatever I'm told leadership from the Republican Party in Congress. And I know many of you feel the Democrats aren't doing enough too. Um, I am hopeful that we are seeing, as Churchill would say, the beginning, not the, what does he say, the end of the beginning or the beginning, where I think we've come through something and it's starting to turn. And it's partly Trump's age and distracting, his sort of, I mean, he's exactly my age. So I'm condemning myself too, but he's, I mean, he's a little older, a few months, but it's. I think we're coming to the end of his domineering dominance, uh, and I think these midterms will help. And when we get a chance to elect a new president, I think there's a very good chance that uh, somebody very different will win from the Democratic side, and it's the only side that can contest it now. But I think Americans are learning a lesson. Let me say this. Remember, I told you there was a video I watched this morning about that said that two Caucasians who were in jail said there was almost everybody was Latino. I cannot believe that Latino Americans are going to continue to think Trump's a good idea. As Adelia always says, we people don't like extremism, and if this is an extreme government with an extreme form of policing and military action. It's an extremely cruel government. It seems to rejoice in its corruption. I mean, it is just about every vice that the framers worried about is now, emboldened in this government. So I think they're cruising for a bruising, and they're going to come down, but it'll be a couple of, it'll take some time here. And I'm hoping it'll be 2 or 3 years, not 20 or 30. Anyway, thank you for listening in. Carol, if anybody wants me to answer questions, as I sometimes do, by email, if there are questions you didn't get to get Carol to ask or pose, I'd be happy to just write to you.
Yeah, I'll send you the chat, Tom, so that you can
Yeah.
see.
Okay. Have a good night, and thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Be well.